Just real quick, quick introduction. Again, Gabe Siftar. I've worked at SRA for about 5 years, and there I focus on hardware hacking, but really anything that has sort of interaction with the physical world. Greg, I promised you I would say cyber physical systems, so there it is. But really, like industrial control systems, operational technology, anything that's again has an impact on the physical world. And there, I'm really doing offensive security, which it's fun to describe it as hardware hacking, but there's a lot more to it. Previous to that, I did about 20-year stint as a design engineer for a medical device manufacturer. I have an electrical engineering degree, so I did a lot of like PC board design, low-level hardware design development. That turned into device firmware, which quickly led me down the path of worrying about the firmware and security, and eventually that led me to SRA. I'm really, really glad to be working in this field, and it's engaging. Clients are awesome. The projects are all really fun. Constantly learning, so it's good stuff. Zach, real quick.
Yeah, so I'm Zach Lehmann, as you mentioned, senior consultant at SRA. I've worked there for about 5.5 years. Before that, I worked for like a large healthcare company in the Pittsburgh area. I actually live in the Philadelphia region now. And I'm a little bit more, you can tell which one of us on the stage here is the hardware hacker, the cooler guy with the short sleeves. I got the long sleeves. I'm a little bit more of a traditional background. More of a blue teamer, got a degree in cybersecurity, and have been in the consulting world ever since. So, want to start us off?
Yeah, and I also want to say I'm really glad to be at RSS. It's my first time at this conference. It's my first time presenting, so apologies if I stumble. And I've heard that this is like the best, and I'm not trying to pander, but this is the best audience to sort of warm up with. And so I really appreciate you guys just being here for this. So just real quick, the agenda for today, we're just going to, again, I want to introduce the term XIoT. We'll describe just a little bit, I'm not going to go super in depth, but a little bit on the attacking of XIoT and the stuff we do professionally. Then turn it over to Zach, and he'll talk about strategies to secure XIoT. If you have any questions that come up, we're going to hopefully leave time at the end for questions. If there's anything that mistakes I made or terms that I didn't explain, feel free to interrupt me in the middle of my talk. So XIoT, why are we bringing this forward right now? Well, it's really been bubbling up a lot in our client work. We see more and more devices coming in. People just want tests, whether it's a device manufacturer who wants their XIoT devices penetration tested before they sell them, or could be end users who are interested in having devices approved to be connected to their network or to see if they're sort of fit for purpose. So there's a lot of our clients are just becoming more and more dependent on XIoT devices as part of their regular business, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare delivery. And so we just think that this area deserves or demands a closer look. But the term XIoT might not be familiar, so I just want to define that. And does anyone use this term on a regular basis? No. All right. So you were right, Zach. Zach, when I asked him to co-present with me, he was like, yeah, but can we change the term? Can we use a different term? And the reason we are saying XIoT here is because it is really a more expansive term to account for more devices that don't fit into traditional IT device sort of cubbies, really. So I'm just going to try to talk about some characteristics of these devices before we talk about specific examples of the devices, just to kind of characterize how a device might look. Of course, they're network connected. That is the I, or internet, in IoT. They are devices that typically interact with the world, so they could have sensors, actuators, it could be image captures, the camera. Typically, they serve a single function. So these are devices that, as opposed to, multi-function computing device like a laptop, it'll be installed and sit there and do one thing and hopefully do it well. They're typically security challenged, so these devices do not usually support EDR, or endpoint detection and response. They usually don't support much in the way of telemetry, so they're really standalone. And they typically also run firmware. So this would be a single software package that's installed. You can't install other applications, you can't install security tooling. When it's time to upgrade, everything gets upgraded at once, sort of atomically. So if you think about like a typical device, a smartphone, which to me might at first seem like an IoT or XIoT device. In this case, I don't consider it one. Again, it's a general purpose computing device, and there are some pretty good tools with respect to MDM. And also these devices run a collection of applications that can be patched or upgraded separately. But a printer, indeed, printers are XIoT devices. They're widely deployed, and we find that they sort of suffer from a lot of the same issues as we'll get into later, but a lot of IoT devices where just find default passwords still, and we find that during our on-site penetration testing, it's really a great target to get or establish an initial foothold, is to compromise the device to be able to get credentials and to carry on further attacks. So what kind of devices are actually considered XIoT? This is an image from Clarity, but I like this one. It kind of demonstrates the many colors of the XIoT rainbow. Across the top there are these different categories. I don't know how well you guys can see it, but it's OT for operational technology, IIoT for industrial Internet of Things, IOMT for Internet of Medical Things, BMS for building management system, and IoT, which is just classic IoT devices. And just a few examples in some of these categories. For OT, the PLC, or programmable logic controller, is a device that a lot of manufacturing plants will use, and they execute really simple programs and are used to control simple processes. Now, the facilities will tie many of these together and sort of orchestrate more complex systems or systems of systems, but the smallest components in those are the PLCs. And sometimes in our work we'll encounter PLCs that control pumps. Sometimes it might be a pump pumping petroleum to or from, like between a ship and a storage tank. Or we've also worked at facilities where they're actually pumping whiskey or spirits. And so all of those have their own, they're mission critical. They have particular dangers. So let's see, under the IOMT category, in that case, there's medical imaging devices. A lot of those fall under this category. They contain protected health information. That's a pretty good target, and we've definitely done a lot of work in that field. VMS systems is another good example. So for HVAC, for example, might not think that there's a huge impact in HVAC systems, but there's been, and I just learned this term recently, there's HVAC/R, which the R is refrigeration, and when companies are doing like cold chain storage, so think about like a vaccine storage, they have to guarantee that vaccine stays within a really tight temperature range for its entire life. And so all of the controllers that are responsible for orchestrating that are also very, very important for that business. So
and BMS actually stands for Building Management System. I know it's not up there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
That's just an acronym that I want to make sure I explain something interesting.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, the benefits of all these systems are real, and unfortunately, they're not free. And so we'll talk just a little bit about the challenges. For each application too, they each present sort of a different risk. But I think from a security standpoint, the challenges, because the devices all fall within that same realm of characteristics, like the security practices are pretty similar. I'm just going to show one more example device too. This is a device, we've worked with several devices of this style. So this is for industrial Internet of Things. This device would be installed in a manufacturing facility, could be water treatment plant. But it really is, it's essentially like a glorified Raspberry Pi. And its job is to basically collect data and exchange it with the cloud or other on-prem systems. It has a pretty extensive interface engine, so it can interface to a lot of hardware. It can interface to SCADA systems and speak a bunch of industrial protocols. And also it integrates with enterprise systems, manufacturing systems that can be used to either collect data from the machines or from operators, or even provide data to the operators about, could have work instructions, could be, what widget they're making today. So we've worked on these devices both from the perspective of the manufacturer, where again the manufacturer wants it tested. We've also worked a bit with clients wishing to deploy these and say, okay, well, is this safe to put on our network, or how can we make it safe, and what, just how would it be configured such that we can trust that it's not going to be used to, it's not going to leak data, it's not going to be used to pivot to their networks. So yeah, this is just one sort of representative example of something that we're seeing more and more, and people are relying on more and more. So these are important, but why should we care all of a sudden? Like I said, these are increasingly deployed. And I thought about this at home. I read some of the stats in production world where they're suddenly starting to outpace, enterprise computing devices in their deployment. Then I started thinking about, well, okay, what about at home? And yeah, like my inventory of devices at home, I have, a couple of smartphones, maybe 2 laptops, and I don't know, 60, I don't even know what the devices are, 60 of them or something like that, just all around the house. So I think it's, we're seeing that kind of across the board, an increase in deployments. And to that, the devices hide in the shadows. So people set them up, you install it, you scan the QR code, it's running, and you kind of forget about it. And as soon as it's serving its purpose, like everyone's busy, so you're off to do the next thing. Turns out that there's constantly security researchers disclosing vulnerabilities. This AccuVox smart intercom, I don't know if anyone caught that. I think it was like a year ago. It's just like a door intercom with a camera, and there was 13 pretty serious vulnerabilities that broke it in every way you could. And then also they're increasingly interesting to attackers. So this quiet exit attack, in this case it's a very standard SSH client called Dropbear in embedded devices that they were able to compromise, establish a C2 channel. And that one was notable because that existed in the environment undetected for 18 months because, again, these devices are in the shadows, so they're not typically suspected of presenting a sort of attack surface. So, but let's take a quick look at some of the vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So I kind of split this up into 2 categories. There's, essentially inherent vulnerabilities, and those are ones that are introduced by manufacturers. Those are things like weak product security. So that could be that it's kind of an old school development team that's not writing secure software, not sort of following best practices. Sometimes they're just slow to patch or update. So they could have a vulnerability they're aware of and say, oh, we're going to get that in the next scheduled release. That's going to be 1 year down the road. A lot of times they ship with insecure default configurations, and that's not even always an oversight. There's at times just this balance between having a device that's easy to configure, that's more plug and play, but then also exposed to more potential vulnerabilities. And yeah, there are just straight up vulnerabilities. This idea that the code is sort of fixed on your device, and something like Log4j was kind of laying in wait until somebody discovered it, and then suddenly there's hundreds of thousands of devices that need to be patched. Then the other category is deployment based. So this is when we purchase it, when we drop it into our environment. These are things that we do have some power over, but there's also very typical sort of things that we see as we do assessments. I would say that a big one for us is to deploy these devices on an enterprise segment. So you'll see one segment with VoIP phones and computing devices and all the security cameras. We also see default configurations. Like I said, it's a very, very typical thing. So the manufacturer makes a default configuration and the end user leaves it. Default passwords is the biggest one still. And then unused features. So it might be that a device ships with 4 or 5 different services running. You only needed one, but the rest of them continue to run. And if there turns out to be a vulnerability, that vulnerability suddenly, you're open to it, where you'd otherwise, maybe if you had shut down that FTP service, wouldn't have to worry. And then just security features. A lot of these things have the option to do, the old and more compatible way or the newer secure way. Do you want to do Telnet or SSH? And a lot of times people are still using the older protocols, the less secure protocols. And finally, the patches and updates are not applied. It's very common that a device is installed and never patched. In some cases, that's because it's hard to patch. Industrial control systems, once a line is up and running, sometimes they don't stop it at all, and they can't afford the downtime. They'd rather accept the risk. Other times, again, those devices are just sort of forgotten about. Anyway, I want to just kind of get on to the favorite aspect of my job, which is the actual hands-on hardware testing. Again, I'm not going to go too deep here, but I'd love to just talk about this a little. So in this case, it's just to demonstrate how we would go about identifying vulnerabilities and kind of just how easy it is on, again, a typical device. None of the stuff I'm going to talk about is actually advanced at all, which, you do too many of those and that can get a little bit boring, but there's obviously a spectrum of difficulty. And I will say too that SRA recently has become a CVE numbering authority, so it's a CNA, where we now can assign, publish, and distribute CVE notifications. And as part of that, we're following a responsible disclosure process, so we need to keep this particular project I'm talking about is still in the midst of that process, so we have to keep a lot of details confidential. I apologize for that, but maybe leaving some of it to the imagination would be kind of fun. Again, couldn't tell you the device that we tested, but I'll tell you a little bit about what it is or what it does. In this case, it's commonly found in enterprise and commercial settings. Very likely a lot of these back at your offices. Stores and transfers sensitive data. Interfaces with the physical environment, which is kind of obvious if it's XIoT anyway. And communicates with a cloud backend system. In addition, this was a project that we sort of kicked off just as an internal research project. It's really similar to stuff we do anyway, but you have a little more freedom, a little more space to pursue things when we do this internally. And the point was to just build our skills and extend our methodology. And the device that we tested, I actually bought on eBay. It still had the previous owner's registration and a lot of the sensitive data and logs in it. That was interesting to find. And I tried to not see it because I didn't want to know. So yeah, there's, when we get a device like this, we kind of chase it in 2 different ways. We'll do logical attacks where from the outside it looks like any other network computed device. Doesn't need to be physical. It could just be a laptop. We would just do port scans, look for services, try to enumerate services, and could fuzz them, could just attempt to misuse them. And then we'll do more physical and hardware-based attacks. So that's where, take it in the lab. If the clients let us, and we always ask, because this is part of a scoping thing, whether or not they want us to, do sort of a light touch, like we can take the cover off and look at it, can't touch. Or there's other ones we're actually allowed to solder onto the board and probe it in all sorts of different ways. And those are the most fun. In any case, so I'll just go over what we found. So the first thing we found on this, and this is not the real device. It's just an example here. We found local access to sensitive data. So this is a high severity finding where we basically found an internal port that's used for manufacturing and initial device configuration, and we're able to just log right into the bootloader. It's called U-boot, and it's really, really common on embedded devices. It's got functions in there that let you just dump the memory. You can extract the file system to identify, basically reverse engineer and identify, every other way and every other defect that they might have built into it. And the impact of that was that we got full access to everything in the device. We could modify files, we could set our own root password. We had full control of the device, so we could activate any of the outputs. We could read any of the inputs and override them. We had full ability to interact with everything that was then connected to the device through its I/O. We were able to access any local sensitive data, so there was log files and configuration files that all contained pretty juicy tidbits. And we could also take the device's identity and use that to impersonate it against the cloud service, so we could access everything that it could access in the cloud. Yeah. Yeah, and this one, like it was, you could pop off a cover.
Okay, so there was an accessible port physically on the outside of the device. You wouldn't have had to take it apart to access the port.
No, we did have to take the port. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we did. The port was on the inside. Yeah.
You look at those as almost a limiting factor when you have to have physical access
Yeah.
from the time you tear it apart. You take that as
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, in this case, like our recommendation for the manufacturer was that they should disable that port, password protect U-boot. So that's, a pretty easy one. And that's not the end of it. We can go steps further, but that's our starting point for that discussion. And then the mitigation, again, for the end user would be to limit physical access, install it on an isolated segment and to be monitoring the network traffic. So if something like this should be compromised, you'd actually know. Okay, so then the next finding is a little bit more severe. This one was a command injection finding. So this device, like a lot of devices, has like a web interface where you can you just configure device settings. There's some test functions. Again, this isn't from the actual device, but this is a really similar kind of attack where we go through the web interface and you just test every field for any indication that there's no sanitization on the back end, so that it might be able to be abused. In this case, we found one field and only one field, so the device was like 95% secure, but there was one field where we could get in and execute commands. Worse yet, the commands were executed as a root user, so in privileged context. And from there on out, it was essentially the same impact, the same access that we got from that local connection, but here we could do that from a remote connection. And I will say it's a local network remote connection, so this isn't from outside of the environment, but it's one less mitigation that we talked about that won't apply here. So, again, in this case, the recommendation to the manufacturer would be to harden the admin interface, continue to test and harden that, and remove the privileged execution context wherever possible. So any of that sort of back-end logic that implements these commands, if it doesn't need to be executed as root, it probably shouldn't. Let's see. And again, the mitigation would just be change the default password because it required authentication for us to be able to get into this, and an isolated segment, and monitor for abuse. And Zach's going to talk a little bit about that if I actually leave him some time. But anyway, yeah, so I am going to be, I could talk about this stuff for hours, so if anyone wants to nerd out, like find me at lunch or just find me out around town. And I'm totally into talking about this and hearing your stories. But anyway, I guess Zach, sir.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about. So Gabe just made it look really easy to hack into these things. So what can we do about that? Like there's obviously going to be some tips and tricks for trying to secure IoT devices across the board. Going to give some very generic tips that aren't really industry specific. I've worked primarily with our clients that are in the manufacturing space, so that's where a lot of my examples and experience go. But a lot of the things we're going to talk about today can be applied to medical technology as well. So moving on, first we're going to talk about a little bit the shared responsibility model. So it's kind of similar to like the cloud shared responsibility model, if you guys have seen that before. But essentially, like a lot of the tips and a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is more on the right side of the slide here, focused on the device owner. I don't think there's many device manufacturers in the room, but if there are, we have some tips on the left side as well for the manufacturers, and that kind of gets into what Gabe was just talking about, is trying to build your products a little bit more secure by design, and have some penetration testing going into before these devices are released to the public. Make sure that they have secure guidance. This is something that they're starting to get better at. But if you're working with these vendors on a day-to-day basis, I would recommend probably trying to push them a little bit, because sometimes the IT security guide and the white papers on security are not readily available on the website. Sometimes you have to ask. So if you're ever working with these vendors, it's good to actually reach out and ask for some of these materials so you guys can learn how to actually deploy these devices securely and use best practices there. So on the owner side, like I said, first part is fairly obvious if you're looking to procure these devices, to kind of go through more of a third-party risk management and have questions specifically for these types of things. Every organization is going to have some sort of process like that, so it's best to try to just kind of integrate that into the process and ask questions about product evaluation, make sure it's got disclosure statements for medical device security, and it's looking to see if it's secure enough for your environment. And then the biggest piece, and probably the topic we're going to talk the most about today, is the secure deployment piece, is trying to deploy these securely. So sometimes, they're getting better about this, but sometimes they're not going to provide that much if you're trying to deploy it on an enterprise-wide scale or for a lot of these devices. So it's good to try to find the recommendations if there are, and then if not, I have some general recommendations later. We'll be able to talk about that a little bit. So I think that's it for the shared responsibility model. So I wanted to kind of take a step back, and this is kind of, when SRA is brought in to do these type of engagements, trying to secure XIoT deployments, conversations generally happen before we get there, and this is generally what I've been told, and I've been a part of some of these conversations. This is kind of what it looks like. This is obviously a little bit of a parody. No human kind of talks like this, but just wanted to kind of give an idea of sometimes, someone will go to a conference like this, a leader, like your CISO or your CIO will go to a conference like this, they'll go to a talk like this, and they'll be like, wow, I didn't know that these things were so insecure. I think we have a million of these devices. How do we know how many there are? Does somebody know? And then they'll go back to their team and they'll ask their team, and the conversation kind of goes something like this. A lot of security departments just I don't know what they are, but we can put them in our SIM, we can put them in our CMDB. And usually site lead, these are folks that are people that are generally working on site with these devices. They're the ones that probably procured them, sometimes outside of the normal IT procurement process. They might have just bought them on eBay, just like Gabe did, and just put them on your network. So getting an idea of where these devices are is very difficult. It's probably the hardest thing to do. And this is a conversation that happens pretty much every single time when talking about this kind of stuff, is trying to get an idea of where all these devices are is the hardest part. And the best way to start is try to figure out and try to work with these site leads and try to get an idea from them where they're at, because as IT security folks, we're not going to know unless we might accidentally see one in our CMDB or our SIM or something like that. So moving on a little bit to the challenging with securing these devices. So I just told you about the initial conversations, and I think the biggest challenge is getting a hold on an inventory. But a lot of the inventories that already exist can be decentralized. Every site, and when I say site, I mean physical building. It could be physical campus. It could be data center. So there's several different meanings for site, but every single one with these types of devices, they're probably going to have their own inventory. A lot of the folks that are jotting down when they're buying these, they're probably just doing it in a spreadsheet on one guy's computer. Or it's not going to be centralized across an organization like your typical IT security inventory, or if you're managing an EDR or something like that, you'll be able to go in the EDR console and search things. Like Gabe said, we're not going to be able to run EDR on these devices, so you're going to have to find a way to manage them some other way, or at least keep track of them by having an inventory. And then the network traffic for these is going to look a lot different. In some cases, it can look malicious. Sometimes you'll get a false positive if you're monitoring your enterprise consoles for threats. You'll see some of this kind of looks like C2 traffic at times when it kind of phones home to an external IP address, and sometimes in an IP address with a different country domain, like Russia or something. I've seen that in the past. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's malicious. You just have to learn what the signals look like. It depends on the vendor, depends on the technology. But sometimes they're phoning home at weird times, and you got to get an idea of what's normal and what's unusual. And then the next piece here is doing that discovery phase. After you have that conversation, like I showed on the previous slide, you might have conversations with the sites. You might think you have a good idea of where all the devices are, but then all of a sudden you'll be trying to deploy you'll probably have some more conversations with folks, and someone new will join the call, and they'll say, "Oh, what about the refrigerator room?" And then you'll be like, "What? The refrigerator room? What was that?" That's a conversation that I've had personally on a call before. Is some guy that worked in the refrigerator room at the particular site was the only one that knew that it existed for the most part, at least all the IT folks that I talked about. So just having more and more conversations and just be ready to discover more things about your company and more things that you do than you previously thought was possible. And then the last piece, I think this is the biggest one, and I'm going to harp on this a little bit throughout the presentation, is a lot of the folks you work with that are working day-to-day on sites, these site IT folks, it sounds like I'm kind of dumping on them. I'm not. It's because they have different incentives. Like they're just working on trying to make everything work. They're trying to get the data they need to make sure that the data integrity is intact, the process integrity is intact, to make sure that everything's working. In some cases, these folks are the ones that are actually making the money for the companies. Like they're producing the products, and if in medical cases, like they're saving lives. So they've got different priorities than IT security folks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You just have to know how to speak their language and make sure that up front you're giving them time and money devoted to security, so that they can actually think about these things and work with you on project-based work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about potential defensive tooling for this stuff. Again, my background is very heavily in the manufacturing space, so that's the example on the left side of the slide is. But there's lots of vendors kind of moving into this like IoT management space, XIoT management space. I know one of the ones that I work with a lot is stuff like Armis, Clarity, Dragos, Nozomi, those type of vendors. They say they try to get like full visibility into your network. And that's really what they do, and I think they do a good job of being quick time to value. Like you can just essentially, and that's, if you talk to one of them out there, I don't know how many of them are out there today, but they'll probably brag about their ability to get quick time to value. You plug in, you start seeing your devices right away. And that's true for the most part. It's very, very easy to plug in, because essentially what we're doing is it's completely passive monitoring. You're not putting in like a new, it's not inline or blocking any traffic, not an IPS or anything like that. It's essentially like a passive IDS, where it's just kind of monitoring and just taking a copy of the traffic. So you can see in the diagram there, you'll have like your security appliance, your Armis, your Clarity collector or whatnot. You'll plug it into switch at the lowest level where these devices are at, and then you'll use what's called a span port, which is just essentially a copy of the traffic that's happening on that switch. And then you're forwarding it to the security appliance, and that's how you're getting all the traffic. And then these vendors will have proprietary algorithms and whatnot to actually identify these devices. So in some cases, you can see devices right away within minutes, like they said. But as I mentioned on the bottom part of the slide there, it is very difficult to get the full visibility that they promise. You need to make sure that you have a really good understanding of your network, and this goes back to, like I said, having relationships with a lot of the site folks that actually know the network is super critical, because you can't know all the network segments without talking to network experts. A lot of these sites, they're going to be different from each other. There's not like a standard deployment, especially if your company has acquired smaller companies. Every site after that is going to be different. Just every company's architecture is different. So very, very confusing, but ultimately it just takes time and effort. This entire process is a journey, trying to get an inventory of all these different devices. So you're gonna go through ups and downs, and getting the initial visibility is good, but I would say don't take it as gospel right away. There's possibly stuff you're still missing based on what the company's network looks like, and you might not know it at the particular time of deployment. So really, this is our last slide here. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overview on, there's some like XIoT like defense frameworks out there, and I wanted to provide some context to those. We kind of read through some of them, and this isn't an endorsement of any of those up there. I'm not saying they're bad or anything, but I would say that they're not necessarily the best. They're still constantly being evolved. There's still new ones appearing every day. I have the 3 listed there, stuff that we've read through. Basically all of them, we kind of condensed the points down to just 5 simple bullet points at the bottom of the slide there. But first thing is authentication access control. And I think the biggest piece here is kind of what Gabe mentioned earlier. The best access control is having any access control at all, changing the default password. Basic stuff like that is helpful, and I agree with the frameworks on that, is that having access control is super critical to protecting these devices, because if you're just taking them out of the box, buying them from eBay, putting them on your network, that's not great. Next is what the frameworks say is behavioral monitoring. So this is like taking a baseline of your network traffic and then alerting on any anomalies. In practice, I've found that this is kind of very difficult to do correctly. I think you have to have a really good understanding of what these devices are used for and typical processes that involve them. Because what I've found is it's very difficult to tell what's an anomaly, because a lot of the folks that are working and reaching out with these devices are doing it in a way, like they said, they've got different priorities. They're trying to save lives. They're trying to manufacture products. And it's not very regular or normal, so it's very difficult to baseline a lot of this activity, but you can baseline some of it. So I'm not saying it's bad advice, but I think this is a very difficult thing to aspire to, that the frameworks are kind of telling you to do right away. So wanted to provide that context. And it kind of goes along with the third point there, log of commands and events. I think they want you to have kind of an immutable log of all commands sent to a lot of different devices in the environment. That's definitely good, but I think, on the right side, I say you want to log all the network traffic, because you want to because these commands, like you said, this new configuration uploaded this device, and you said that to a SOC analyst, they'd be like, well, what do I do with this? What does this mean? I think having the network is a lot more familiar to us IT security folks, is having the full network traffic, because then we can alert off our signatures that we already know, and we can get the full context to be like, this just came from a particular computer that I know that Dan, the engineer, is using. So it's a benign alert. Next piece, protection of data. That's something that all of them talk about, and that's a very general statement. Very general, making sure that data integrity is paramount. I agree with that from a general perspective, but I would say that there's still kind of hashing out what is best practice for this there, because the data that's in these devices is so nebulous that it's very difficult to tell. So I'm not saying ignore this section on some of these frameworks, but I'd say it still needs some work and some maturation before I can recommend it to others. And then the last piece is response plan. Everyone says, hey, have a response plan. Yeah, that's great. But more specifically, in our experience, you'll see number 4 is, I think you'll want to test your response plan. So essentially, like having tabletop exercises, I call them TTXs. You'll want to have specific IoT injects in your TTXs, so that you can say this device is popped, or this medical device is popped. What would we do? And I think you would be amazed at some of the responses of the security folks to be like, I don't even know where to start. So I think just getting that response out of them and having that conversation is super helpful to driving basically any project you want to do in the space is doing something like that. And then last piece, our conclusions of experience, is segmentation. I'm sure most of you have heard the word for this before. Just trying to segment these devices off into a piece of the network. This is something that everyone is trying to do, some sort of segmentation project, at least what I've seen. But just having these devices in mind when you're doing segmentation is important. Don't forget about them. Don't just focus on, we want to keep our engineering computers and our IT computers separate. This is the gray area that we're talking about. IoT is kind of a little bit of a gray area, so just keep them in mind for any segmentation projects that you're looking to do in the future. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions here. So any questions from the audience? Yeah, sorry. I know, I got to go like that, I guess, yeah.
So, really a couple of things about it. I went to university. So, we have the challenge both of IoT devices that are being bought and put into our new building with no idea of their security controls around them. Even in basic programmable forces to change the default password. We also have what I'm assuming is going to be tens of thousands of bring your own IoT devices on campus on a given
I could take that a little bit. It's getting better. It's not great, but I think the more cutting edge and newer companies that don't have to drag along like a lot of the legacy processes and products, like they're off to a much better start. A lot of them will take like reference designs and start with those, which means they might have processors that support secure boot and the whole security from the ground up. There's also a couple, for like medical devices, for example, there's now a new pre-market guidance from the FDA that really brings in a lot more cyber. Trying to think of what there's the whole sort of SBOM awareness that's been going on the last year or two, which really is like represents supply chain. So to be able to trace components from third-party component makers all the way down to the end user, and hopefully that opens up just more communication so that the shared responsibility piece, the sort of communication that has to take place between entities is just more open and more normal.
Yeah, and on the defense side, I will say that like firewalls are now getting smarter about being like IoT protocol aware. Like you're able to actually write rules on firewalls in there. It'll actually just detect the protocols on something like Palo Alto is able to detect these types of protocols going out. So that's getting better. But yeah, that's still not the best.
I just wanted to mention when you were talking about the IoTs and whether printers, fall into those and adding, I just wanted to mention that, I mean, I'm going to do it. So a lot of our printers actually do allow applications to be installed on them. Plus, they also integrate with the accessible interface platform, so developers using an SDK toolkit can create their own applications and put them on their print. So, though I still agree with 100% they are IoT devices, they are now getting so sophisticated that the lines are going to be blurred. They're definitely, I would not be able to classify them as a single function system anymore, although we do have single function printers and multi-function printers.
Yeah.
The fact that they're scanning, copying, and printing, and managing data, and hitting the cloud, and using all of these apps, that can do things, they're swiftly blurring the line.
Yeah, it's more like a platform.
They're becoming more and more complex, and it's not just I mean, it's all those, Canon and Ricoh, and those are all the different companies that are migrating to this.
Yeah.
It's more data management versus print, right?
Yeah. And if you can't, if your traditional security tooling doesn't support it, at least, from the perspective of security, if you want to put it in that other bucket, if you know what I mean, if it makes more sense to treat it as an IoT device because that's the only defenses you have, then, like,
No,
and
it belongs there, for sure.
Yeah.
Now they're just so much more complex.
yeah, and that is the weird thing, that's, I think, like XIoT versus IoT, like the sort of idea, the notion that they're going to expand that definition, is important right now. Yeah. There's one more question back there. No? Yeah? Yeah, I mean, like the smaller the segments, the better. And are you familiar with the Purdue model? And so it's just like a almost outdated notion, but a lot of people still follow it in industry. Where basically you have multiple layers. You have your enterprise network up top, and then you've got like a DMZ that separates your manufacturing layers. And so a lot of times what they'll do is anytime you have to any data that passes between like the operational technology layers and the world above it, the internet or your enterprise servers, has to pass through either jump box or a proxy server or something like that. So they, even for like updates, they'll have an update server that lives in the DMZ, and that way there's just no direct communication. But it really, it's a risk base. You have to kind of figure out what the impacts of any of these things getting popped would be, and take sort of the appropriate response, because it can get crazy real fast.
Yeah, and I would look at the Purdue model. It's a good overview of when to do that. And the bottom line is that essentially like put putting more firewalls between different levels in that model will always make it more secure.
All right, anything else? Awesome. Well, yeah, like I said, you can come and find me if you see me walking around, and I'll nerd out. But thanks for coming. Thank you.
Wanted to present you with